Australian Energy Week is taking place in Melbourne June 9th to 12th. With the free Expo Pass, you can walk the expo floor, see live demos, and catch 12 plus hours of expert sessions on the Insight stage, all included with your complimentary pass. The expo brings generators, networks, retailers, renewables developers, and BESS specialists all under one roof, showcasing the technologies and solutions driving the energy transition forward. Whether you're sourcing new suppliers, evaluating emerging technologies, or simply staying ahead of a rapidly shifting industry, the Expo gives you direct access to the people and products shaping the future of energy in Australia. To get your free Expo Pass, visit www.energyweek.com.au/visit-the-expo.
You're listening to Energy Insiders, a weekly update on clean energy and climate policy with Renew Economy's editor Giles Parkinson and leading energy analyst David Leach. Energy Insiders is brought to you by Evergen, providing cutting-edge energy management software for battery optimisation, virtual power plants and distributed energy resources. And Pylon, helping solar installers and retailers design high-resolution solar proposals in minutes.
Hello and welcome to a very special episode of the Energy Insiders podcast. We're all sitting here in a studio in Alexandria in Sydney, very special with the Energy Insiders logo around us. People listening onto the audio file on the SoundCloud probably won't notice or won't even care. But if you get the opportunity to see this on video, then it's going to be very exciting. Sitting here in the studio with our logo, and we're going to have some graphics and maybe even some videos through it too. My name is Giles Parkinson. I'm the Editor-in-Chief of Renew Economy, and joining me as usual, but this time sitting across the table, is ITK Principal David Leach. David, I shouldn't ask if you trust you're well, because I can see that you're very well.
Well, I'm well because thanks to our guest today, I had a great lunch, and looking forward, therefore, to instead of having a sleep that I normally do after lunch, to talking about the transition and all the part that I guess Tesla has to play in it as well.
Yes, well, there you go. You sort of sport the introduction to our special guest, Josef Tadich. You're the APAC Regional Director for Tesla Energy.
Yeah, thanks, Giles. Thanks, David, and thank you for having me again. It's great to be back and have a bit of a chat about what's going on in the industry. Thank you.
Yeah, look, it's funny. We always come to a studio when we're interviewing. It's fantastic.
Good precedent.
So much to talk about. There's a lot happening in the energy transition in Australia, particularly in battery storage, both grid scale and small scale. This week, we've seen some extraordinary numbers out for the EV transition, 20% share of market of the market, new car market, diesel sales tumbling down. So that's exciting. But I wanted to start. You've actually contributed an article to Renew Economy this week, and it's a really interesting one. It's called about the Kardashev scale, after a Soviet astronomer. Is that right? He's an astronomer. That's right. And it sort of talks about humanity's progress in the world and how it relates to their ability to harness energy. And I guess in this case, it's harnessing energy from the sun.
That's right.
Tell us a bit about Mr. Kardashev.
Yeah, no, thank you. It is a fascinating concept, and this the concept of the Kardashev scale and energy abundance, which is ultimately what this is about. It's something I've noticed over the last 10 years in Silicon Valley. It's been discussed, but the last couple of years, particularly now with the transformative impact that AI is having on our society and the way the intersection of energy and AI and how that unlocks some people are calling it the third industrial revolution.
Mm-hmm.
But fundamentally, Kardashev was an astronomer in the 1960s during the search for extraterrestrial intelligence, and they posited the question of how, if we're looking for extraterrestrial intelligence, how do we know what sort of size civilization are they going to be? And his concept was, it was a percentage of how much of the local star's sunlight impacted that planet, how much they could harvest was an indication of how technologically advanced they were.
So he was thinking about solar. This is in the early 1960s.
Absolutely.
Because not many other people were thinking about solar at the time.
No, they weren't. And what
Actually, I read a lot of science fiction, and I can tell you that there was so much post-war science, and it was kind of converted into fiction. And whether it's your Paul Anderson, James Blish, Heinlein, Asimov, they did think about it that way because spaceflight was just starting. I think when did Yuri Gagarin put his first, went to the moon when I was in primary school, or up into space rather, and a dog went up before that. So, and I think even then it was sunlight anyway. Sorry,
That's true enough. That's true enough. Yeah, but for the terrestrial power grids, not much.
Not much. Absolutely.
Yes.
And so the concept was type 1 civilization harnessed all of the solar energy impacting that planet, and a type 2 was they could harness all of the energy of the entire local star, right? And that was the concept. And then one of my heroes from childhood, who actually got me into engineering in the early days, was Carl Sagan, and he popularized this, and he came up with what was called the Kardashev scale. And it's a logarithmic scale from 0 through to 2, and it shows how much of the local star's energy we harness. And to put that in perspective, if we look at our local fusion generator, which is the sun, generates 380 trillion terawatts of power, which is an enormous amount of power.
That's even more than the proposed, XAI or whatever the SpaceX market cap, isn't it?
Slightly more.
Not that much, but anyway, maybe next year.
But what's fascinating to me is when you look into this is, that sunlight travels 150 million kilometers to get to Earth. And by the time it gets to Earth, there's still 120,000 terawatts of power that impacts the Earth. And if we look at how much...
And then some of that energy gets trapped on the way out, doesn't it?
Yeah, so that's what we call the solar installation. That's how much the Earth's surface receives, and some of that, and that has really powered civilization, and that's our food production and our weather, and all of that turns into wind as well as solar energy.
And now threatens to cook us.
And now threatens to cook us. But if we think that through, like post-industrialization, now we're roughly in the order of, as the amount of primary energy the Earth uses, that's fossil fuels, non-fossil fuels, nuclear, renewables, everything. Is 20 terawatts, right? So it's roughly 1/10,000th of the resource available from the sun is what we use right now. And if we further drill into that, only about roughly 15% of that power is electrified, so through electrical grid. So about 2.8 roughly gigawatts is running, right? So if we go through that data, right? So what that shows is the Kardashev scale is about 0.7, so there's a lot of the way to go. So really, to harness the additional energy, we only need a tiny fraction of that, and that's the concept of the energy abundance, that marginal increase in energy, which then can fuel a technological developments through into whatever field that may be. And if we then further look through that lens at Australia, and how much we actually receive in Australia. So about 1,800 terawatts of solar power we impact in Australia, right? Which is an incredible amount. We use 180 gigawatts primary energy, total energy source, which is a lot of power, but still it's only about 1/10,000th of the amount, and about 27 gigawatts of average electrical load. And if you do the math on that, you could power the entire planet with about 6 or 7 hours of solar generation in Australia. And you could power the entire electrical grid in the NEM for about 3 minutes. 3 minutes for a full year of the NEM and the Swiss electrical generation. And the idea there is just to get an understanding of the abundant amount of energy available which we can harness.
Because we've always talked about abundance in terms of sort of minerals under the ground, which we've got to extract and things like. And this is just like sort of put out a solar panel and then it comes down. That's
right.
With a few more complications.
That's right.
But it's a different way of actually just thinking about abundance. It's a different way of thinking about
that problem.
The way we manage our economies.
Yeah, and if we think about the fossil fuels, I mean, that's really just a form of solar storage over hundreds of millions of years. We're digging up and burning it. But now we can cut out the middleman directly. The cheapest cost is to harness that solar, that wind directly.
We're not just cutting out the middleman, it's also cutting out the pollution. So where does Australia lie in this then? Are we a type 1 or a type 2 civilization? And do we have to care about that?
So we're not even close to a
Is that a one nation categorisation?
Well, it could be. But we might be writing someone's political slogan.
But in the Australian context, interesting one is to note is we are an energy superpower. We export 2.5 times more energy than we use in the form of coal and gas.
I think to put it another way, we're a second or third largest thermal energy exporter. One of the things about sunlight, of course, is it's very democratic, the same as wind. Like it tends to fall. Every country gets some sunlight.
Yeah.
Not every country has thermal energy resources.
That's right.
Yeah. But we could also export a lot of our sunlight in different forms. Yeah, not with a cable.
Well, it could be a cable. You know, there was talk of of doing that via compressing hydrogen, whether or not that plays out, or ammonia. But fundamentally, though, the issue is we have A, an energy superpower in terms of natural resources, but B, we're an energy superpower in the amount of renewables available here.
Yeah.
So we can definitely surpass and displace the fossil fuels we're burning right now, quite simply.
And in fact, I think that is a fundamental economic problem for Australia. It's easy enough for us to talk about decarbonising our own economy, to talk about it and even to do it to some extent, but it's hard to understand exactly how we're going to replace the thermal energy exports.
Yeah.
You know, it's been one of ARENA's objectives, I know, for many years, but I don't think myself that Australia has a clear way. Hydrogen turns out not necessarily to be the way today. You can manufacture using energy in Australia. You could put a cable to Singapore, but I don't exactly know how to take advantage of that from our international position.
Well, there's been a few studies there. I think the Australian Superpower Institute's got a few ideas about that, you know, sort of value added in terms of sort of minerals and processing and doing all the things that Australia hasn't actually done. But it does sort of talk about just the potential, I think, that we have in this energy transition. And we seem to be just over the last couple of months or the last year just hitting a few milestones. We just kind of think that things have changed, both in terms of electric vehicles, which I guess has been thrust upon us more rapidly by the events in the Middle East, but also in grid in terms of large-scale storage, small-scale storage, which we will get to.
Yeah.
But I did want to just touch on cars. I know it's not your sort of direct responsibility on EVs because you look after the battery division, which interestingly enough in Australia is actually one of the few places in the Tesla world where battery revenues have more than car revenues.
Yeah.
You might have to sell a few more batteries this year because the EVs are doing very well.
Yeah.
But EVs are now at 20% of car sales, new car sales in Australia. That just seems to me to be a bit of a milestone. What do you make of it? I mean, it's a fantastic month for Tesla, record sales, 6,400 and something or other, and I should have remembered the number. The Model Y doing 5,600.
Yep.
Easily the number one seller.
Yeah.
Diesel utes, diesel SUVs crashing down.
Yeah, 100%. Look, it's interesting when you look at all technology adaptation, there's this S-curve, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I feel like probably the last 10 years of my career, we've kind of both on the battery storage side and on the EV side, we've been in that kind of that starting and progressing and slowly increases. But now that S-curve progression, I think we're there generally on EVs. So I think that first 5% of market share was really hard convincing customers to completely change the way they're doing transport. Same with utility scale batteries, convincing market operators and developers and owners and banks and investors that battery storage could have a return. But now I think that demonstration, that track record has gone through. We're in that S-curve in that high growth now. So, and particularly the fuel crisis, nothing like a good crisis to have an opportunity. But what they'll probably historians will call a third oil shock, I think. That has really propelled it through. And I think we're going to see the increase in EV penetration really rapidly.
And in fact, there was an article written by Ambrose Pritchard in the Telegraph that was reprinted in the Sydney Morning Herald. He's a great writer, not always right, of course, but he writes really well, pointing out that Trump, in a sense, with the oil price crisis, has really pushed us into that. Out of the initial part of the S-curve into that fast transition where people are not doing it for feel-good reasons. They're doing it for plain economic reasons.
Yeah. No, it's fascinating. And if you look at like the fundamental numbers, like in the electricity generation, we do total Australia about 240 terawatt hours a year roughly of electricity generation. The fossil for liquid fuels for transport, it's in the order and equivalency, and they use different numbers and gigajoules and megajoules and terawatt hours, but it's around about 500 terawatt hours of energy is used in liquid fuels for transport.
That's not the
primary
demand.
energy.
I think the number is that if every car and truck was electrified, it'd be at about 40% to electricity demand.
Yeah, exactly. So if we go through that, and this is fascinating when you do the math and you realize how inefficient combustion vehicles are. If we go through that, roughly. We burn, as Australia, 150 million litres of fuel a day, roughly. And that's absurd. It's like
of which more than half is diesel. And so I think that's the thing that people don't realise. We about 10 or 15 years ago, we crossed over from being a petrol economy to a diesel-driven economy.
Yeah, that's right. And a majority of that is imported for a whole bunch of different reasons. But if we took 1 million EVs, like an average EV, And, I know we all have different dreams and aspirations and careers, what we want to do, but the Australian Bureau of Statistics cruelly breaks this down into roughly about 1,500 litres of fuel we burn and about 13,000 kilometres we drive a year. So if you're using that number, and my own experience, one EV uses about 2,000 kilowatt hours, 2 megawatt hours roughly, which costs in the order of a couple $100 electricity usage roughly. But that surpasses 1 million EVs, so 2,000 kilowatt hours is 2 terawatt hours. So that's 1% of NEM demand right now. So that is less than the amount of constrained renewable generation we have now.
And for Tesla and cars, that's really important. But from Australia, the statistic I come back to is that to go, 1 kilometre in a diesel semi-trailer costs you about $1 at the moment. To go the same kilometre in an electric truck like a Tesla Semi or some other one would cost probably no more than 20 cents. And if you're doing 100,000 kilometres a year, or some of those semis do 200,000 kilometres a year, that's a huge saving.
A huge saving. And if we further progress those numbers, 1 million EVs, disposes million combustion vehicles. That then reduces the amount of fuel we were burning by 1,500 million litres a year, which is 10 days of liquid fuel consumption as strategic reserves, right? And so that's 10 days of oil consumption we don't have to bring in, and high prices and sovereign security. So there's a bit of a no-brainer in my mind.
Our oil import bills, sorry to go through these statistics, we've been through them again, but they're always worth repeating. We import about $60 billion worth of oil products a year after allowing for our oil exports. And, if we replaced all of that, it would be like building an export industry, except it would just be import replacement, which to an accountant like me is just as good. Not only that, people still need to be told time and time again that we have the second biggest consumer, I think, of diesel in the world, and our entire economy depends on the diesel transport of food and all other essential goods all over Australia. And it's quite obviously a huge risk, irrespective of the climate, irrespective even of the economics. The risk in being so dependent, more than just about any other country in the world, is absurd when we can do. It's so easy. It's so easy to do something about it.
And we seem to have been sort of hit this sort of milestone moment in cars, 20% of new car sales. And as David has alluded to, there's been a lot of discussion about electric trucks recently.
Yeah,
Tesla has just started commercial production of the Tesla Semi.
Yep.
You're driving one over putting one on the ship and bringing it over here. I don't think we've seen one yet. We've seen a couple that look like Tesla Semis, but they're made by the Chinese rivals. But it must be time.
Yeah, I mean, it's part of that electrification. As we were saying before, roughly 15% of our energy usage is electrified. We're going to increase that percentage of it, and it's going to be cheaper, and we're actually going to use less energy because it's more efficient, right? Because in EV, we use about 1/10 the amount of energy as a petrol car, roughly. And on the trucking, we see the same thing. Right now, there's a strong, heavy demand, particularly with oil prices in the US. So as the factories ramp up, of course, the primary market will be the domestic market, and then we'll go to the
We've
export.
usually got to wait 3 or 4 or 5 years before the models come over here,
sure,
whether it's
yeah,
your company
yeah.
or any other company,
right.
although the Chinese companies are moving pretty quickly.
Yeah, we are seeing that.
Yes.
And if you look at the and I follow the China market very, very closely, the amount of electrification in freight is incredible. I think it's around about 25%.
So I think Giles said you're the Director of Energy for Asia Pacific. So
David, I'm going to interrupt because I can see you moving away from the EV discussion. I
wasn't. I was going to stay on it.
Oh, were you now? Okay, well, I'll let you continue then.
provided we include trucks and things like that.
Okay.
Yep.
So I was thinking, is that okay? I guess that means that you would get to visit China and some of these. And what can you tell us about the electrification of cars and trucks in those countries from your perspective and from Tesla's perspective?
Yeah, I mean, I've been going to China on and off for the last 15 years or so, and particularly you see it in Shanghai a lot, but you also see outside of that, you're seeing an unprecedented electrification of transport in China. Particularly, it's very obvious with the light passenger vehicles. You see that it's almost rare to see a combustion vehicle now, particularly in Shanghai. Outside the rurals, it gets more complicated, of course, but usually that's the way the technology will slowly spread. We also see on the freight side, light commercial vehicles initially, now for heavy haulage. They've got some really innovative models there, particularly battery swap stations. Like originally, the plans were in the early EV days, and in fact, Tesla, at the original design, allowed for that. was to change the battery pack on the light vehicle, but supercharging now is so cheap and quick it doesn't make sense. But on large trucks where it can be a couple of megawatt hours, right, swapping over those battery packs and then charging them when renewables is abundant, it's kind of starting to make sense in China. But we're seeing that. We're also seeing on the high-power chargers.
I just am interested in your thoughts on that because we've seen this in cars, and I think it's is it NIO that still does the car battery swapping.
Yeah.
And they get better, but the charging standards have gone up. And, in China, we've got flash charging now for cars and starting to be rolled out. And in trucks, we've now got a megawatt charging standard.
Yep.
And then there's the kind of economic value chain of whether you want the battery owner and the swapping station.
Yeah, there's always been an issue, right?
It seems to me that the batteries charging is speeding up, and so that the advantage that swapping has might gradually diminish. But I don't know what you think about it all.
Well, as I said, in the early EV days, there was still. And I remember there's a company called Better Place. That was their idea, was to swap the battery packs. I remember that from the early days.
Gassy, I remember.
Yeah, that's right.
The guy, yes, it's really good.
Memory lane.
Yes.
And it went through, but the economics didn't kind of work out because partly it was expensive to change a battery pack. People were worried about using someone else's battery pack. It's an expensive investment. But really, the technology for charging, for really level 3 DC charging, accelerated so quickly. Now our version 4 supercharger is 350 kilowatts. Is usually you don't charge from 0 to 100%. As you know, when you're on a trip, you usually get in at 20, 30%, top up to 80%. It's like 5-10 minutes, right? It's actually quicker and cheaper to.
You don't have time to go to the loo or get a coffee these days.
That's kind of part of the problem, right? A lot of charging stations, you get pinged for idle charges before you get.
It's like you're standing there waiting for your latte.
I'd argue that the charging stations have actually been badly designed because they're designed for pull in, park, get out. Whereas the charging speeds are going to be such that you almost need the traditional through, the car stacked up at one end and driving through and out the other end if you're going to, I don't know.
Yeah, right. No, there's a lot of interesting ways to do it. And then I think part of the charging rollout is, you have the high power chargers for regional trips and long trips, but also it's also important to have lots more access to lower power chargers, inner city chargers. And I think there's been a whole bunch of debate on how we do that.
Well, there's a big debate about who should get to roll those out, whether it should be the hands of the networks or private operators. Yes. And I haven't quite got my mind around that. I can see the argument on both sides. So you guys aren't really into AC charging. I mean, you've had your distributed, your sort of your destination ones.
Yeah.
But are you about to do like a Tesla curbside thing?
Oh, we manufacture the hardware, the wall connectors, so the AC chargers, which is up to 11 kilowatts for the 3-phase. But we would provide those and we often.
You hang them from a power pole out in the street.
Well, there's no reason why we can't. Yeah. Right. There's no reason why we can't. I think the issue there has been really the monetization of that, and terms of how do you charge, and that's the hardest point. Is being the charge point operator. Is if in charging for the energy, right? Yeah. But I think these are all issues which everyone's going through, but they'll be solved.
I'd like to ask one more question about EVs before we get onto the grid, and this is about vehicle to grid. Tesla's just announced that with the new Model YL, that's the 6-seater, now has vehicle to load in Australia, which is very exciting. It's been a long time coming because there's been a lot of other cars have vehicle to load made available. What's brought you to this, and how far away from vehicle to grid?
Yeah, exactly. So this is an interesting one. So the vehicle to load, we originally launched it with the Cybertruck and was called PowerShare, and effectively what it is an onboard inverter. So in fact, it's a grid-forming inverter, Giles. So
grid-forming inverter.
I'm sure you'd like that.
No more synchronous condensers, just Tesla cars.
So that you could then run off your power tools, auxiliaries, whatever you wanted to do. But we then connected that to the network, right? And in the US, you can do that. So you can connect through and have the vehicle's onboard inverter, because the cheapest way to do it is you fit the inverter at the factory, do it at serial production, roll it out. The marginal cost is relatively small. Then you can connect to the grid, and then you can either control vehicle to home or vehicle to grid. Now, in the Australian context, vehicle to home, vehicle to grid is the same thing, but you're still connecting to the network, and you still have to meet the grid connection requirements, which is fair enough. So at the moment, we're just doing the vehicle to load, and you have an adapter. You can run all. So it's effectively an inverter.
So you can make a cup of tea, you can have PowerPoint, you can do power tools and things like that. Okay, so what's the timeline then for vehicle to home?
And so as we move through this, we rolled out through to all vehicles because it makes sense for all vehicles, kind of globally, is just to have that inbuilt.
Yeah. And what about my 2019 Tesla Model 3?
Whether or not be a retrofit, I don't know. We'll have to see how that goes with the old Fremont silver trims. But if we logically go through that, the big pipe thing now is to go through those regulatory changes required to effectively connect a vehicle's inverter to the grid. Whereas at the moment, we're really focused on AS4777, having a separate standalone PV inverter, understanding the connection requirements, having the PV export or site export limits. So this is really, in a way, what we don't want to do. We don't want to grid certify a whole vehicle, but we want to have that inverter on the vehicle. There's the lowest cost of market entry.
Would you be participating in this newly announced expanded trial with Amber and things like that? The federal government's thrown another 13 million. They've got 1,000 vehicles in this vehicle to grid.
Yeah,
they've just been using a Chinese competitor of yours.
Yeah,
and they were looking for more.
Yeah, look, I mean, I can't comment on that trial, but what I do know, there are third-party charges. So it's effectively a third-party inverter, so external inverter, which connects over DC to the vehicle, which you can then grid connect. But our view on that is the cost of doing that is a little prohibitive, so it's much better off just to use the onboard vehicle and make it as cheap as possible, and then we can get the adaptation.
You wouldn't do that trial anyway because you're using somebody else's charging equipment. So.
Yeah, well, you're sure you could use the vehicle.
Wrong company to ask.
Yeah, maybe.
So I think that's one of the things that's holding it back at the moment is that is the cost of the actual equipment per installation. Economics aren't there, but no doubt they will be. And you're suggesting that the value proposition to the consumer can be improved by having most of the equipment in the car, essentially. So.
I think it's important to remember the consumer because it's their vehicle, and it's what's the value the consumer kind of gets out of it. We've got to make sure the regulative processes kind of catch up to having that value. And there's always going to be competition on that value, right?
I'd like to come back a little bit more and talk a little bit more about Asia because I don't hear enough about it.
Sure.
So we've talked a little bit about China, but if you were to run around the other areas that you look at in Asia and sort of talk about, one, how fast the industry's changing, and maybe if you can, what you see as the opportunities for Tesla in some of these countries like Vietnam and Thailand, South Korea, Japan. There's a lot of population, a lot of oil imports, a lot of energy consumed. What do you think?
Yeah. And as I said, the Australia story we're going through in the transition is not unique to Australia. Every country is going through that. And I would argue that it's more existential in some of these Southeast Asian countries, which are wholly dependent on oil imports, and the relative cost to consumers there is much, much higher. And so particularly in Vietnam, we're seeing like the impact on new car sales on EVs. It's over 50% from what I last saw. Even in Nepal, I think I saw the value for the percentage for Nepal was over 85%.
Yes.
For Nepal, which is amazing.
But Nepal's a small market. Thailand, Japan, they're big markets.
They're big markets. So we are seeing the same stories throughout Southeast Asia, in Japan and Korea, of course, mainland China. Amazing amount of transition, but we are going to see, because we're getting that increase in volume of production, particularly the manufacturing in China, reduces that serial production, reduces the marginal cost of the units, reduces the price. So, and as I said, I think this is where we're at on that S curve now, such that the price point, it's no longer now a question of is a green decision to buy an EV. Now it's like it's a back pocket decision of an EV. A new EV is in.
So would you be putting charging infrastructure in these countries, Tesla charging infrastructure?
Yeah. So the markets which we operate, we have we put our own charging infrastructure in, and of course we do that just to make sure that to increase the adaptation rate of EVs. But ultimately, then there should be third party and depending on the level of government operation of that market, putting their own charging standards and having that competition in the charging is a great thing.
And what about manufacturing and assembly? We've mainly talked about cars, but you do. I think China is Tesla's second biggest market geographically for sales, isn't it?
Yeah.
I mean, I sort of think it's like about 40-40 United States, China, and 20 the rest of the world percentage-wise. I mean, I might have those numbers wrong.
I would never challenge David Leitch's grasp on numbers, so they sound fairly close. Sound fairly close to me, but we definitely seeing increase in numbers across the board on the EV, but we're also seeing, which I think is a great thing, that level of competition now, and consumers are spoiled for choice in the amount of EVs available. And you can see on the road just here in Sydney, just driving in, right, the amount of different EVs available, and the way the manufacturing landscape's actually changed, right? I think our kids will see vehicles very differently the way we see vehicles.
I'm sure they will. And in terms of where you want to put your investment in energy, like manufacturing facilities, if you're maybe let's talk a little bit about megapacks just for a moment. Have you got plenty of spare capacity?
Yeah, so if we look at the megapacks, a great example. So traditionally we were manufacturing in the US, and we still are manufacturing US. In fact, we've got a second factory, Houston, starting up now, and that is been exporting traditionally. The amount of demand has gone up, and as you've seen, just the adaptation rate, particularly on residential and utility scale storage, has gone up significantly, such that we opened Shanghai, Megafactory Shanghai, which services effectively most of Asia Pacific and Australia, and also parts of Europe actually as well. And that's really, we're doing that to get the cost point down, but also to leverage off the high level of integration, the supply chain in China in terms of the local manufacturers for the cells and inverter components and structural steel. And there's a massive amount of supply chain there. Same with the EVs. The reason we're seeing, you can get an EV now for sub $30,000 new on road, but it was unheard of. Like when we started, like 10 years ago, when the Driven started, that was a dream, right? It was. And while seeing that impact for consumers is great.
Talking about those little bits, and another question that comes up is about technology, cell technology. Yeah. And of course, Tesla's famous for its NMC technology, really originally. Which I suppose must have been Japanese or South Korean in its origin. And then there's the kind of shift to LFP, which lithium iron phosphate, which has advantage but also disadvantages. Yeah. And then there are emerging technologies like solid state or semi-solid state.
Sodium ion, lithium air.
I don't know about sodium ion for cars so much, but for solid state, for stationary storage. Yeah. What can you say about what you're seeing in terms of, let's talk about LFP versus NMC first of all. Yeah. Are they both going to continue to have a place?
Yeah, so when I first started Tesla, 10 years ago, so NMC was the dominant technology. Because that cathode chemistry just hit all the right spots. And in battery chemistry, they have a concept called the spider plot. And the spider plot is basically showing if it can operate at certain temperatures, certain costs, certain voltages, certain powers and energies. And it's got to be kind of a Goldilocks. It's got to meet all of them. Like some cell types may be great at number of cycles, but really expensive, or vice versa. So NMC, so nickel, manganese, cobalt in the cathode, ticked all those boxes. Then as it progressed through, and that was Panasonic actually, we really did a lot of innovation on the cathode design. As we progressed through, LFP really started to hit, and that was commercialized heavily in China, particularly CATL were one of the early innovators on that. And the LFP technology doesn't have the same energy density or power density, but in terms of stability and in the terms of the cost per kilowatt hour.
And in charge speed, I think, as well. So it tends to push the industry towards fast charge speeds and essentially lower duration for a given amount of weight in the car.
So that's definitely been part of it. But we've seen with that LFP adaptation and the commercialization and that cost point, like the price point in real terms from when I started to now has probably dropped 90% in real terms, right? And this is why we're seeing there's a massive boom in home batteries, utility scale batteries, and EVs. And this is why the S-curve, we're going to keep going.
And LFP is also arguably better suited to utility storage and home batteries than like NMCs when you put your foot down and you really want to go somewhere.
Yeah, well, particularly the cobalt provides that level of power, which is you can get it out of LFP, but not the same level. And utility battery, really, particularly in the early days, was high power, low duration. Now, most of the utility batteries going in now are grid forming and 4 hours plus, right? So they're sitting at a couple hundred megawatts for, the AGC would take them up and down, but usually for longer durations of power rather than short bursts.
And another thing that's been going on that we've talked about on the podcast before when we come to stationary storage is the higher energy density per pack, if you like. Yeah. And I think when we spoke to what's his name, Damien Nix, he mentioned that if you've got less concrete pads and everything like that, your installed costs come down a lot.
Yeah.
Have we reached the limit of where we can go there? And if I could double barrel that question in, it's partly about not just the cells themselves, or mostly about the cells, but a little bit about the inverters and things like that.
Yeah.
Inverter technology is pretty static, or are we moving on as well there?
No, and I think, so to answer your question on the energy density, and the energy density really is driving down the install cost, and that's really the game at the moment. It's just to shave off that 0.5%, 1%. We're increasing the energy density. In the early days, each pack, Power Pack 1 was 100 kilowatt hours. Power Pack 2, which is Hornsdale, that was 200 kilowatt hours for one of those packs. Now we're up at 4.5 megawatt hours. Next gen, we're going to see 6 megawatt hours. We'll see 10 megawatt hours fairly soon, I would think. The inverter technology has also evolved rapidly. Silicon carbide switching is kind of a higher speed switching, particularly for grid forming. If you want to have grid forming, you have to have the high speed switching is coming through. And also the voltages on the inverters are also increasing, coming through for efficiency.
Because I think, based on my model plane experience, which makes me a world expert,
Model planes.
every time you've got a choice between more amps and more volts, you want to choose more volts, basically.
Yes, that's right. Yes, you want to go more volts because that reduces the current, and reducing the current reduces the costs of the conductor you're going in, the efficiency and the losses. So the higher the voltage, the more efficient it gets. And when we saw the same thing in the wind industry, the solar industry, particularly utility scale solar, as the solar inverter levels started getting higher and higher for efficiency.
I hand back to Giles, but the guy I read on LinkedIn a lot, Marek Kubik, who was one of the early innovators in this and still follows the battery industry very closely, he was kind of suggesting that maybe the reduction in battery costs until there's some new step change, like maybe solid state or something like that, is kind of where towards the floor now of what we can do with current technologies, or at least the rate of cost fall is slowing?
Well, I'd say and you can never call the end, right? But in that rapid S-curve adaptation technology, we're now at the point where it's so low that the incremental gains will drive more. So I feel like that's where we are. Will there be a step change in new technology? Yes, there definitely could be, and I think everyone's monitoring it, and the market is highly cognizant of that, looking for what is that killer new technology going to disrupt EVs? Right? Could it happen? Yeah, it could. It could. Yeah. And it's the same in the power generation as well.
You mentioned grid forming inverters, which is the big. I mean, basically all the batteries now come in with grid forming inverters of various capabilities. You and some others have been arguing forcefully for a couple of years now that it can replace all the system strength and system services that offered by coal generators. You haven't quite won the battle because there's a lot of synchronous condensers going in. How's that sort of debate evolving? I'm actually waiting for AEMA to sort of do their 100 megawatt mini grid to sort of test your theory, but maybe they don't. Maybe there's no network company that wants to sort of offer them
to drive it.
Yeah.
So, and I think I spoke about this last time. I think if we look at the power system, it's been 150 years of running synchronous generation, and we've got a lot of experience in different edge cases and both with market operators globally, as well as OEMs and consumers and distribution companies, transmission companies. And I think when we're changing fundamentally an electromagnetically coupled synchronous generator, which we know how it performs, and it does that without a controller, it's a predictable response. When we go into more of a controller-based system, we fundamentally have to question what some of the drivers are for having that synchronous generation, and part of that is just building up that experience. And I think we've demonstrated that significantly. And I think AEMO's got a great engineering roadmap of basically building blocks of demonstrating particular technology levels as we go through. I think the grid forming side, in particular the voltage stability, I think we've been showing that for quite a while, and I think that the voltage stability, I think that's almost put to bed. Like we've shown that yes, we are resisting changes in voltage and frequency, and it's predictable. It's just like a synchronous generator or condenser. But now I think the next level is now we're looking at in those corner cases of if we are in a low synchronous generator grid with low fault current, if there's a fault somewhere in the network, will the response of the current from the inverter be similar and replicable to a synchronous generator, such that we're operating the traditional primary protection system, so the breakers to open in a fault. And I think that's the next level we're working on. And this will also take time, but we're getting through there. And I think what we will see we're getting more reliance on that. And we're seeing in SA, we're seeing a single generator dispatch for SA, and they're quite comfortably operating the whole of SA on generator now.
So the issue is not so much the technology. You're arguing that technology is there. The issue is just really just the evolving sort of, the grid management sort of principles.
And getting the industry happy. And because remember, these events happen in very, very fast scales, right? Very, very fast. And as a society and politically, the system, we expect this incredibly high resilience to the network, and as we should, right? So it's about just building up those experience through. And I think that's happening, and we're going to see that's going to accelerate as more of these grid-forming inverters are coming into the market.
It's almost 9 years now since the first Hornsdale, which is the big battery, went in.
Yes.
You worked on that, I'm pretty sure.
Yes.
And I think we discussed that last time.
Yeah, we did.
We're just about at the stage now, I think, David Osmond, who tracks these things very closely, as you all do.
David.
I think you pointed out that the over the last 12 months, battery discharge overtook gas generation.
Yes.
That seems to be a milestone, because I thought that we need a bucket load of gas generators.
Yes.
I've
been following that closely, particularly in WA more than in
WA has been
extraordinary. It's been extraordinary.
Yes, and you guys have built a lot of that. So just sort of tell us about just the significance of this. I mean, we just seem to be at this stage now where it's achieved critical mass. It's changed the thinking about the grid. It's obviously keeping a cap on prices.
Yeah.
It's now an essential part of almost any solar, and we're starting to see more wind projects.
Yeah.
You've got some thoughts on that?
Yeah. I mean, if we start maybe with the home battery side, because it's a lot easier to understand in terms of, we did a massive solar boom, lots of solar exports. The exports dropped to marginal cost during the day, which is close to zero. And so people were investing in these solar systems and realizing, during the day, exporting, not getting much. In the evening, we need to get that value back, so we're buying expensively. So that solar self-consumption model for home batteries really took off, and home battery schemes really kind of captured that down. And effectively, that's taking the customer, their load, their evening load off and covering it from the daytime production. And that's kind of an intuitive thing to understand. And if we look through at the broader power system and the large rollout of utility scale battery storage, we're seeing... Yeah.
Just if we just spend 1 second just talking about that, I'm just trying to think. I mean, you mentioned earlier on that evening load in the NEM is maybe 25 gigawatts on average, for a number, maybe. And if we say there's 400,000 home batteries out there, and they're doing maybe 1 or 2 kilowatts, but let's call it 2 kilowatts, or even 2.5 to make the arithmetic easy.
Right.
That's a gigawatt off that evening peak load just there, isn't it?
Yeah. And we're seeing that formation come through on the operating demand, load, because that's all behind the meter.
That's what's visible, is the operational side.
That's what's visible.
And you've got batteries going on there as well. Yeah. But just interested, if you're trying to estimate the home battery side, it's already arguably knocking 3 or 4% off that evening peak demand.
Yeah. I would. It is hard to estimate because we don't actually see that net demand, because we see that's post the battery discharge into the customer's home or behind the meter. So, but yeah, definitely that is going to impact that, and it's also that's increasing our load during the day, so it's increasing that solar generation. So we're getting a lot more out of our behind the meter solar generators during the day, I think, and we're reducing that peak, and I think that's going to flow through.
We do see the utility side of things, because AEMO, I've got to give them a plug here, they are fantastic on their data releases. As far as I'm concerned, I don't know, there may be other grids around the world that release as much data as promptly as AEMO, but I don't follow them, and I do follow AEMO, and they're right onto this utility batteries, and I personally monitor the state of charge of the whole fleet and by region. And I think maximum storage we get up to now is about 15 gigawatt hours. And when I started monitoring it about 6 weeks ago, it was 13.5 gigawatt hours. So, and basically every Saturday some new battery comes on, and and that's also starting to impact on the market as well as the home battery. And a lot more of that to come, I guess.
Yeah, a lot more of that to come. And you would have seen that, I follow Open Electricity Light, and you see the records. There's just pretty much every week there's a new record in one state on the battery, discharge power or charge power. But what effectively we're seeing all of that cheap renewables, that abundant energy going into the batteries, charging and discharging into the peak, and that's going to is effectively just displacing those higher marginal cost peakers, right? And we're seeing that in WA regularly. Batteries is exceeding the site.
And I got a lot of stick on LinkedIn when I said earlier in the year that when you look at the actual quantity of utility batteries, I think it's not going to displace just the gas. I think it's actually going to eat into coal volumes marginally for at least some of the year. And when it eats into volume, it's not just the impact on price. You're taking away all the revenue. And that's if you're a coal generator that's not making any money during the day because solar has already pushed your price down, and you're expecting to get all your return in the evening and then overnight, that's going to have quite an impact, in my opinion.
And what is the impact then on the home storage? Because you're suggesting then that it's kind of flattening out the sort of the price profile, particularly if it's clipping, a gigawatt off the evening peak. And I remember when you guys first came in and challenged the initial FCAS market in South Australia, and one more megawatt would, sort of cause this sort of massive rise in power because you just basically had this cartel that was there at the moment. You guys came in and smashed it and say, "You want another megawatt? Well, here's a megawatt, and you can have it dirt cheap." But with the home battery storage, keeping a cap on those prices, what's that doing for the economics of arbitrage for grid-scale batteries? And does it matter that much?
Yeah, I think one of the fascinating things, particularly in Australia, is we've got a competitive energy-only market. So the price is set by the marginal generator. So one more megawatt, that's the price.
Exactly.
So what the home batteries are doing is they're reducing that expensive marginal generator. So it's reducing the overall price to all consumers, right? And so that this is a great, and this was a known kind of impact of when the scheme was implemented, and it was a great scheme the way it was implemented. So what we are doing now is effectively we're displacing the higher cost generators because we're reducing that load effectively. So reducing load or increasing generation is really the same thing.
But my point is it doesn't just affect the higher cost generators because everyone gets the same
It's a pool price, right?
Yeah. It affects every generator.
Exactly. So what we're going to see is we get more of this storage coming online. There's more competition in the evening peaks. And more supply will reduce down prices, and we're going to see also more demand during the day will probably increase prices slightly.
But the trouble is, as you and I discussed, Giles, earlier, at the moment it's taken away all the price signal for new investment. And that's the trouble with an energy-only market. You do need to have confidence that your product will have a value when it's built. Perhaps, Joseph, you could talk a little bit about what you're feeling about from your customers in the utility scale. Are they keen to get on with things, doing lots of stuff? If you were asked to forecast how much battery, solar and wind was going to get to go ahead over the next couple of years, would you just be saying lots, little, don't know?
Yeah. Well, I think you really got to look at it at first principles. And look, going back to this energy abundance concept, like across Australia, is about 240 terawatt hours we use roughly, right? Over the next, 10 to 15 years, what will be the electricity growth, right? Is it going to go down? No. Like we know the data centers are increasing. We've got a rough idea. It's a couple of 2 to 4 terawatt hours now. Could be 12 by 2030. Could be 50. Could be 20 by 2050, right? But so that energy growth is going to increase. We're decarbonising and electrifying, so that is going to go onto the electrical grid. So the overall pool, we're about 240 terawatt hours now. We could be, 500, 600 terawatt hours, in 15 years, depending on the way this all kind of rolls out. But if we think about that, the new energy coming on will be providing that, right? So we are not only replacing thermal generation now, we're increasing the overall pie. So the investment case is clear. It's like we need to be deploying.
You're in my camp. If you build it, it'll be okay.
Yes, 100%, right?
But is that the way your customers are seeing it?
Yeah, and so and this is the thing with an energy-only market. It's kind of it's a starve and famine kind of thing, right? We wait for the famine prices to go up, and then we all invest, and then we all starve, right? And that's the cyclical nature, and that's the way the markets kind of work. And I think that there is an efficiency through there, and I think part of the particularly the discussions, the industry discussions on the ESEM and how we can kind of take that starve and famine out and sort of have a cap and collar and kind of have a bit more of investment certainty, particularly in the later years. That isn't important because ultimately the developers may have a real view, but you need to get the debt markets comfortable with that, and the debt markets really just want to have a dependable, reliable return. They don't really want to have this get paid 30% one year and negative 10% the other.
So if I was to make a slightly analytical comment, your view is it's stuck in the financing stage at the moment.
Yeah, I think there's the yes. I think that is probably part of it. The overall is the market now fit for purpose when we are really trying to get as much renewables on now. Noticing that we need to go into an oversupply situation.
Yes, you've got to build in front
to be able to turn off the thermal generators.
I agree with that.
You can't run half of Loy Yang. You've got to run.
No. You've got to build the replacement stuff first, and that means that everyone will earn a lower than required return, because by definition, you're going to be in oversupplies for a while.
And this is just a question of time. In my view, a question purely of timing. The trajectory is very clear. Will be my view is that I think electricity consumption will be expanding. Probably 3-4% compounding, probably more.
And while we're on that, you mentioned data centers, which is the word of the year, I think, or the phrase of the year. What are you seeing about, I guess, the demand for batteries within data centers? Are you getting some inquiries along those lines?
Yeah, no, 100%. Definitely we are. And if we think about data centers, and what I find fascinating is just what we're doing as an AI is effectively doing is we are transferring from human work and intelligence into a tokenization analysis and GPUs running this power.
Token humans, did you say?
But don't quote me on that one. But effectively what we're doing is we're creating this additional abundance of work in data centers. And that manifests itself in electrical demand. And is that increasing? 100% yes in Australia. In the US, a lot more so because of the large language model, the training models themselves, which usually they're kind of in the gigawatt scale, and they usually have to run full power for several weeks.
And as I keep saying, they also stop running instantly for a few seconds while they coordinate, their training loads that need a lot of have to do a lot of sums, maybe in slightly different places, and you get these milliseconds or even whole second delays. And batteries seem so well suited to handling those kind of instantaneous on and off power loads.
And so we're seeing in the US, particularly in ERCOT, in Texas, a lot of the battery applications there of the load smoothing, such that you have behind the meter, you have a gigawatt data center, you may put a couple hundred megawatts of batteries through there, and that battery is really just smoothing out the connection point such that when the data center drops off, because it's thinking about something else, with the way that the neural network's trained, we are injecting through. So we're smoothing out that power. And also, as a power smooth, the voltage is smooth, and we're making it a lot easier for the power system. And look, we're probably going to experience that in Australia through here. We've probably got some different issues in Australia because a battery is treated as a scheduled generator. We're not allowed to ramp up super quickly on the active power for a whole bunch of very good reasons. But we are seeing that battery using for smoothing and also for backup, right? There's a lot of diesel generators being connected up in Australia for that edge case for lack of grid.
If you're going to build 8 gigawatts of data centers, which is what I think Keith Middleton was talking about only a week or two ago.
On this podcast. Right.
That's 8 gigawatts of diesel gensets. So, if you're an investment banking analyst, you want to buy Caterpillar.
I still can't get my mind around that, about why we need all those bloody gensets. But you have explained it to me several times, David. But I just thought one of Joseph's batteries would have solved the problem.
But you could fundamentally do that. And this is a question of reliability and how we maximize.
And because they want 4 days of reliability and things like that.
Yeah, and because not the data center operates.
Where's your 116-hour battery then?
Well, as I've said a few times, you can run a battery as long as you want. It's just a question of what power setting you set on that. Well, and I think that's the way the market's going.
We shouldn't talk about long duration storage. We should talk about the total quantity of storage required. And then the power to get it out is just a subsidiary of that.
Yeah.
I'm going to take that as an indirect comment on my story I wrote today about 4 and 8 hour batteries. Thank you, David.
No, that was a wonderful story, Giles. You made a point that some people have been making for about a year now.
I wonder who that would have been. Solar and battery hybrids. Are you guys involved in much? This seems to be the big new thing in the Australian grid, but I can't quite remember whether Tesla has been involved in the detail of it.
Yes, So yes, we definitely are heavily involved in the hybrid model, and the hybrid model is really having multiple generation sources behind the same meter. It could be wind, solar, or battery. In fact, one of the actually, I think it's probably the first NEM connected hybrid systems. We did up in Queensland. quite a while ago.
Was that Kennedy?
That was Kennedy.
Oh, there you go.
There you go. That was a 2 megawatt battery with solar and wind. But it's really the detail then is how those generators can dispatch, and if it's as a single DUID or as separate ones. And I think there's the industry is kind of going through that at the moment. Should it all be scheduled generator, or should it be a semi-scheduled plus a battery? But effectively, on the engineering side, it's the same thing. So we're putting the same batteries and the same solar on the same connection point.
Right.
And we've been doing that for quite a while.
And what's that mean? Does that mean it's cheaper cost, cheaper connection?
Yeah,
cheaper,
I think
cheaper everything.
Cheaper everything, and there's also particularly wind is fundamentally, wind hybrids are really important. They are a bit more complicated because it's not as less predictable, whereas solar and battery works really well because particularly in Australia, middle of the day, solar generating power prices are high. We're not going to be discharging. Very rarely we'll be discharging coincidentally with solar. So one of the constraints we have in the market is the substation and the amount of power we have available for generators, for applicants to connect to. So if you have a gigawatt available, you can put a gigawatt of solar and a gigawatt of battery, and you can use that. It increases the utilization of that connection point.
Yeah. And what about wind then? Because we started to see a couple of wind hybrids selected in the latest generation tender.
Yeah.
We haven't seen any being built yet. We've only just started seeing the first solar hybrids.
Yeah.
So are you in discussions with wind developers?
Yeah, 100%. We're discussing with most of the developers now. I think the problem, the challenge, everything's a challenge, but wind particularly is they haven't had that rapid cost reduction, which the solar is hit.
Just that, we'll get to that, but just talk. I think I understand, but explain it again for me, so I'm sure I understand about why the use of batteries with wind is different to the use of batteries with solar, because they might both be wanting to compete for the line at the same time if the price signal was there, and because the wind might drop very suddenly and then come back, and it's just a little different to the predictable nature of solar and batteries, isn't it?
Yeah, in a way, it's less predictable. So if we have a look at the US market, solar hybrids dominating effectively there at the moment, and a lot of that's driven by you have an AC connected battery and an AC connected PV behind the same connection point, and effectively the battery is charging, and the solar's actually not exporting at all. It's charging straight to the battery, and it's discharging on an offtake to the evening peak. So all the market operator there, so that would be CAISO, is just seeing 200 megawatts dispatched at 4 p.m. through to 8 p.m. And that's great. And if we look through in the Australian context, we see the same thing is a predictable solar. So we're charging, and they can have a predictable discharge. But in the evening discharge, in the evening peak, and usually it's the morning now as well. And you've seen it in the data as well. You see
that's
that
where the 2-hour batteries are well suited to twice a day discharge.
Yep. And we're also seeing that peak's getting longer and longer in the evening. But so what that does is the same connection point can be discharging in the morning and the evening, and also the solar can also be exporting at the same time, and on the same connection point, we're not constraining it. Whereas a wind farm, it may be, and if you have a look at WA, great example, you got when the doctor kicks in the afternoon and the wind is kicking up in the evening, we're seeing those winds exporting to the evening peak. So having a battery at the same time may constrain either.
It pushes the battery into a different price point.
Yes, puts it into a different price point, but also may have physical constraints on the amount of megawatts with the hosting capacity.
Yes.
Yeah.
But all solvable.
So a few sort of regulatory issues to sort of get minds around. We've only got about 5 minutes left, I think, in this podcast. So maybe just we'll go. First of all, just dynamic pricing. Then I want to get on to distributed networks too, and some of the opportunities there. But dynamic pricing. I think Tesla sort of argues that we're starting to see it now in South Australia, and it's slowly starting to come through in other markets. Sort of explain why that's so important for
on the consumer side. Yeah, so I think we've got dynamic pricing on wholesale, of course. Every 5 minutes, there's a dynamic wholesale price, and that's the basis of the competitive markets through here. But on the retail side, on the residential side, the customers generally don't have that exposure. It's usually managed through the retailer, and the retailer provides a great value for the average consumer load and hedges around that and provides that as a fixed price. But with dynamic prices, that's fine. If you're taking load, that's fine. But what if you are then exporting, right, and you've got a price responsive asset, you need to be able to respond to something. So such that if there is a high market price, there needs to be a signal and a value share with a customer to warrant exporting your expensive battery, or to warrant investing in a vehicle to grid charger and putting your EV charge into the market. I think that transparency is fairly important. But also the flip side to that is, if we have a lot of behind the meter price responsive hardware or devices, we need to make sure that in the price formation of the wholesale price, we know that these will be bidding into the market.
Yeah, they've got to be as visible.
They've got to be visible. So this is the visibility of price responsive assets, and otherwise what will happen is we'll get a bit of a mismatch in dispatch.
And there's still an argument that if you just set tariffs right, you can get more or less the same mass market statistical effects. Not quite the same as responding to a transmission line breaking. It won't work then, but as you say, a lot of pricing is relatively predictable, and I would argue that the right tariff structure might be even a more cost-effective way.
The right tariff structure isn't. And look, really, the power system should be boring 95% of the time.
It should be.
It should be just not. We shouldn't.
Well, if you listen to this podcast, it
should
certainly
be
is.
Like me talking this podcast. It should be pretty boring, but 5% of stuff I say is interesting. But that 5%.
Dad jokes anyway. We've probably got a collection of dads here.
No, I've been told not to.
But when prices are high, and before we go into lack of reserve and we start talking about the wholesale demand response and enacting the RERT, there should be an ability for price responsive assets above a certain threshold, and I don't think it should be like a couple of cents a kilowatt hour. It should be like when it's up about $1,000 a megawatt, whatever that nominal value is. Then we start to have that value.
0.5% or 1% of the time that we've had historically.
Exactly.
I just wanted to. We are running out of time, and I wanted to ask a very small question about just the efficiency and productivity, and particularly of the connection process. There was a report today from the Clean Energy Investment Group about approvals, which is a whole different topic. But in terms of getting stuff connected now, do you reckon AEMO is doing a good job? Has it improved? How's it going?
Yeah, I mean, for full disclosure, look, I'm a non-executive director at AEMO, of course, but speaking of my own personal capacity, the level of, I think we've gone through a level of maturity in terms of the industry, in the level of readiness they are on the connection package and how they present that through. And I think we've seen the increase in the volumes on the connections. Connections are used to, I think, were 5 years ago maybe a choke point. I don't think it's the same choke point it was on the connection side, because we're putting so much through, and as an industry and as the people working on AEMO on the connection side and the TNSPs and the proponents, we know what we're doing now.
And I do want to ask, because in New South Wales there's still a lot of debate about this kind of REZ shared connection modelling and everything. How are you feeling about that?
Oh yeah, I mean, that's part of like this batching or bundling concept, and then there is efficiencies in that, because we're taking one snapshot of the grid and we're looking at one scenario, such that we don't have to look at 15 different iterations. We can look at one with everything on. Complexities of that is they may not all be ready at the same point.
I think all will be not ready at the same point.
Or they may not be ready, and so
none of them are going to be ready at the moment.
So but there's efficiencies in batching for sure. That's logical, and a lot of market operators around the world are doing that.
Yeah. Which takes us back down to the distribution networks and the potential, and sort of, I think, what's now seen as a largely untapped potential, and the potential role that distributed networks have in sort of managing their own grids, and tapping into those opportunities. It seems to me like it's going to be quite crucial as we're...
Yeah, I think distribution network, traditionally generators connect at transmission, with CERs obviously distribution, but will we see kind of that sub-transmission generation connecting at distribution, more of that? Yeah, 100% we will. Yeah. But at lower voltages, it's harder to put higher power because of particularly the way on the voltage stability and the fault ride through at distribution is very different to transmission. So it's a little, in a way, it can be more complicated, but there's definitely the infrastructure is there. So and society has paid for all of that distribution network and transmission network. We should maximize the utilization and efficiency of that infrastructure.
And look, just maybe one final question, and it sort of comes on to sort of, social license and things like that. It's quite surprising seeing some of the pushback against batteries by some communities. Often communities are 100 kilometres or several hundred kilometres or even 1,000 kilometres away from the battery is. But there just seems to be a few myths around. Well, you can tell me whether they're myths or not. There's concern around the impact on batteries on local environments. And they talk about bushfires. They talk about leaching of chemicals into the soils. They talk about danger to the barrier reef.
Noise, even
government standard. Just tell me how safe a battery is. A big battery.
Yeah. Look, I think part of this is, new technology introduction, and we're changing the use of traditional ways of using land for agriculture, and we're using it for power generation. And it's important to recognize and to address the concerns of the community, because a lot of times it can be a bit of a black box, and it can be a scary thing to be confronted with something completely new, which has just been thrust upon you. So I think it's important to go through that consultative process. But in terms, if you look at the facts on the ground statistically, in terms of batteries, the battery safety is like, there's been very limited number of actual events. There's very limited impacts on noise and visual amenity. But we did, and I'm showing my kind of age, but I remember going through all of this in the wind industry 15 years ago, and the backlash against wind. But as part of it, as we I guess learn a bit more about technology, and we actually go and see it, an actual operating wind farm, operating battery, and go, that's it. Oh, that's not that big a deal.
I think it's like self-driving cars. Familiarity breeds a kind of perhaps over-relaxation with it. I think people love their coal communities. They don't mind living next to a coal mine or a coal station. You can talk to them about the health impacts till you're blue in the face. They don't really care.
Well, particularly if they work there, and that's that's their lifeline, and the community lifeline in the centre of their communities. And things
that's
like
right.
That. And
that's
I just sort of, that's what struck me when I went up to Liddell for the second time in a few years. First for the closure of the coal-fired generators, and then last week, for the smokestacks coming down.
Yeah.
So, it's a pretty profound moment for the communities. And as you say, that's introducing new technology does raise questions and what have you. Joseph, it's been great having you back on the podcast.
Thank you, sir.
And
David.
Yes, and it's been great actually sort of doing this in this studio with our logo. I didn't realise we had such a nice logo. I think
it's a pleasure to discuss the industry. I really enjoy it. Thanks
as always, Dave and Giles. Thanks for having me. Cheers.
And that was we've been talking with Josef Tadich, the Regional Director Energy for Tesla in the Asia Pacific region. We'll be back with another episode of the Energy Insiders podcast next week. So goodbye for now, and thanks for listening, and thanks for watching too if you're seeing it on video.
That was our all-in-one, wasn't it, Giles?
That was our all-in-one, and you were just interrupted very quickly.
Energy Insiders was brought to you by Evergen, the market-leading renewable energy software business that optimises residential and commercial solar and battery systems. Evergen enables large numbers of systems to operate as a single fleet, so network operators can use them as a virtual power plant, generating significant value for consumers, network operators, and the energy system as a whole. Evergen software is powering the energy system of the future. Energy Insiders was also brought to you by Pylon. Pylon provides easy-to-use solar design software for installers and retailers with pay-as-you-go pricing, no monthly cost and no lock-in contracts. Join Australia's top solar companies who trust Pylon to design high-resolution, CEC-ready solar proposals.